Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Gritty Fantasy Podcast. My name is Karsten, and despite our name being Gritty Fantasy, we also like to talk college football on the show. So today we're going to be breaking down the national championship game, which is being played in Hard Rock Stadium in Miami, Florida. And so this game is on Monday, January 19th, and will feature the number one Indiana Hoosiers against the number 10 Miami Hurricanes. So the spread for this game is -8.5 for Indiana, and it features the number one graded team according to PFF, which was the Indiana Hoosiers, and then Miami was the number four graded team, again according to PFF. And something which I found interesting was Notre Dame was also tied for number four according to PFF, which isn't really relevant for this game, but I thought it was a interesting fact for the playoff controversy that we had at the beginning of the playoffs with the selection committee, and how comparable those teams have been. So the key matchups for this game, I think, lie in the trenches. So first, we're going to take a look at Indiana's run game against Miami's D-line. So Indiana has the number 7 rushing offense in the country, and that is going up against the number 14 run defense in the country, which is Miami's defense. So Indiana's run game has been the backbone of their offense all year, which is heavily RPO based, and even going back to last year, Indiana's offense was heavily RPO based as well. So if Miami can disrupt the run game, it puts the weight of the Indiana offense onto Fernando Mendoza's shoulders. So far this year, though, Mendoza has been extremely capable of handling that pressure and handling that weight, as he's been extremely efficient, as we all know, winning the Heisman this year. And he's really had to put the Indiana offense on his back sometimes, especially in games like the Penn State game, or against Oregon, where he had 5 touchdowns. So Mendoza's been fully capable of doing this, but the question is, can Miami force him to do that, though? So against run defenses, which graded over 90 on PFF, Indiana ran it for a limited amount in some of their games. We're going to break it down based off of the 4 games that they played against teams which had those top run defenses. So the first game was Oregon away. That was week 7 of the season. And in that game, Indiana went for 111 yards on the ground on 37 carries, and that averaged out to 3 yards per carry. In that game, Mendoza went 20 for 31 with 215 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. So in that game they're clearly limited on the ground, only getting 3 yards per carry, but they were still able to move the chains. And in that game, it really did seem like Indiana was dominating the game, and that was kind of a shock to the senses, since it was the first time we've seen Indiana really take it to a top 5 team. Not only take it to them, but win that game. The next one was against Ohio State in the Big Ten Championship. In that game, Indiana ran it for 118 yards on 34 carries, which averaged 3.5 yards per carry. In that game, Mendoza went 15 for 23, 222 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception again. So again, they were limited on the ground, but as we all know, Ohio State was one of the best defenses in the country this season. And really one of the strengths of that team was their run defense. So even though it was limited, it's understandable, and they were still able to move the chains and obviously get the win in that game. And then in the Rose Bowl against Alabama, Indiana ran it for 215 yards on 50 carries, which is a huge jump from the last 2 games. In that game, they averaged 4.3 yards per carry, and Mendoza went 14 for 16 with 192 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. So that's really a huge step up from what we've seen from Indiana against these really good run defenses. However, Alabama's run defense did grade out closer to 90 than Oregon's and Ohio State's did. But even still, this was complete domination on at the line of scrimmage. And really, once Indiana got ahead to such a large lead as they did, pretty much by halftime, then Alabama was forced into passing situations, whereas Indiana was able to run the ball and kind of just kill clock. even though that they still didn't let up on the gas. They were still throwing the ball and they were still running the ball the same as they always do. But they really had a lot of success in all areas of the game against Alabama. And the same goes for the next game, which was against Oregon in the Peach Bowl, which was a rematch, obviously, of their first game against Oregon. But in this game, they had a lot more success on the ground. So Indiana had 185 yards on 40 carries against Oregon the second time around, and that averaged to 4.6 yards per carry, which is a huge jump from their 3 yards per carry in the first matchup. In this game, Mendoza also went for 17 out of 20 on completions, and he also threw for 177 yards and 5 touchdowns with 0 interceptions. So Ohio State's D-line is the most comparable one to Miami's, and Indiana had limited success on the ground, where they only ran for 3.5 yards per carry. However, as we know, they still won that game, and the same goes for the rest of them, even though against Alabama and Oregon, they had a lot more success on the ground. So Indiana has shown that they can win with a limited ground game, simply because Mendoza has been spectacular all year round, obviously winning the Heisman. And Indiana has the second highest graded pass offense in the country, so it's difficult to see them getting off schedule in either part of their offense. Especially in the playoffs, Mendoza has had at least an 85% completion percentage in both games, and so he's been highly efficient, only having 5 total incompletions across both games. And so he hasn't really needed to do a whole lot, only throwing the ball 20 times against Oregon and 16 times against Alabama. But when he has been doing it, he's been doing it well, and he's been doing it cleanly. And so it's really difficult to see anybody throwing the Indiana offense off schedule. However, Miami's D-line has the potential to do so. And they also held Notre Dame to their worst rushing offense all season, which granted was week 1 of the season, and Jeremiah Love did not get very many carries. But even still, it really shows what the Miami personnel can do against a very talented rushing team, and some of the best rushing teams in the country. So now we're going to take a look at the pass protection versus the pass rush. Miami has the number 1 graded pass rush in all of college football. Indiana's pass pro graded out to be 17th in the country, so there's definitely an edge towards Miami in this aspect of the trenches. So it's essential for Miami to be able to take advantage of that edge that they have and get pressure on Mendoza to force him off rhythm, as we were saying earlier. With how clean he's been playing this year, it's really important that Miami is able to affect him and really hurry him up and get the offense off schedule. So against Penn State, Indiana struggled with their pass protection and their run blocking, which was the O-line's worst performance of the season by far. So Miami has to replicate what Penn State did, as they were the only team that came that close to knocking off Indiana. As we know, they needed that incredible third down completion, where it was really like barely a centimeter in. But that's what it takes to beat this Hoosier team. So we need to see if Miami is going to be able to do the same thing against them. And to combat that, Mendoza needs to be able to continue using his legs to move the sticks when the pass protection breaks down. And we've seen he's been able to do that time and time again. He's ran for first downs, and that was a big part of their success against Alabama and Oregon, was when the plays did break down, he was able to scramble and get a few yards on the ground. On the other side, Carson Beck needs to be able to withstand pressure from Indiana's D-line. And he has to play clean and avoid turnovers, especially because Indiana is lethal on capitalizing on opponents' mistakes. We saw this against Oregon in the Peach Bowl, where Oregon turned the ball over 3 times and Indiana scored 3 times. So they are incredible at making sure that they punish you for your mistakes, and they also do not make mistakes. So that's a really key part of the game for Miami, is that they need to be very clean, and they need Carson Beck to play pretty much how he did against Ole Miss at the end of the game, where he was just completely dialed in, and it really seemed like he could not miss. if they can do that, Miami will have an excellent chance to be in the game towards the end of it. Um, but really, the question is, does any of this even matter? Indiana's been a buzzsaw all season, but especially in the playoffs. There have been multiple instances where they've played a team with similar profiles as Miami, as we talked about earlier, where we went over the Oregon, Ohio State, and Alabama games. Um, and as we've seen, they've started peaking kind of at the right time, where as this season went on, they started off with 3 yards per carry against Oregon, and then against a significantly better defense, they ran for 3.5 yards per carry against Ohio State. And then once the playoffs started, they've gotten way better going up against really good run defenses, going for 4.3 yards per carry against Alabama and 4.6 yards per carry against Oregon. So as we've seen, they've gotten better running the ball, and they really have not been able to be stopped, even though it's not 6-7 yards per carry. They've been able to get success on the ground running it for over 4 yards per carry against these playoff teams. And Mendoza's also been the most efficient he's been all year passing in the playoffs. So they're really peaking at the right time, and it's unclear what it takes to stop this Indiana team. They've gone up against really good D-lines who've been able to disrupt stuff. They've gone up against really good secondaries throughout the year, and it has not mattered. So it's possible that Miami does everything we talked about and still loses because Indiana is able to grind out 3 yards per carry, and Mendoza is running for first downs, and he has a 85% completion percentage for 250 yards. And so it's really, we need to be able to see out of Miami what it would take to win this game because we haven't seen it yet. So to predict this game, I am going to ride with the buzzsaw that is the Indiana Hoosiers, and I'm going to pick them to win and cover the 8.5 point spread. All right, so now I want to take a look at some of the storylines that we're seeing in this national championship game. And the first one is that this national championship matchup is really showing the new age of college football and casts a spotlight on all the ways which college football has changed over the past few years with the transfer portal and NIL. Miami has been spending big in recruiting over the past few years, paying high school recruits top dollar to bring them into the program. There's a lot of debate in the college football world over what the correct NIL strategy is and whether it's better to pay for proven commodities in the portal and not focus as much on high school recruiting, because if you recruit a 5-star player, they're not going to want to sit around for 2 years while they develop and then start in their junior year. They're going to want to start immediately. Whereas other people are saying that it's more important to focus on your high school recruiting and really only add a few key pieces in the portal. But for Miami, they're doing both. Their willingness to spend big has clearly paid off as they have transformed their team and made it to the Natty, which is a huge step up from what they have been over the past 20 years. And so by building their roster through NIL, going to high school recruits, and bringing in key portal pieces who are proven contributors, Miami has transformed themselves into becoming a national championship contender and possibly even a national championship or champion, depending on how the game Monday goes. So in this current era of college football, enforceable rules on NIL are practically non-existent, and Miami is taking full advantage in all aspects of their recruiting. They have the resources to do so, and they have the willingness to do so, and as a result, they have no problem spending huge money on bringing in key O-line and D-line pieces, which is really showing up now in the playoffs as they've been dominating the line of scrimmage. And they've also been able to bring in key players like Carson Beck or pay incredible talents like Malachi Toney to come in and commit to the Miami Hurricanes. And by doing so, they've been able to really transform themselves. And it is really highlighting that trend in college football where without this clear rule structure for NIL, teams are able to pay a bunch of money to bring in people. Indiana has built their roster in a different way, though, and they represent a very different trend in college football, which they are pioneers for. So Indiana, who are now backed by billionaire Mark Cuban, have turned around their roster by leaning heavily on the portal. When Cignetti took the Indiana job, leaving JMU, he took a ton of his JMU team with him and supplemented the rest of their team through the portal. And this has really changed the mindset across college football when looking at bringing G5 teams into these contending teams. Um, and this can be shown with Eric Morris leaving North Texas and going to Oklahoma State, where he brought a significant portion of his team with him, and Alex Golish going to Auburn, where he also brought a bunch of players with him. And so it just shows this trend of when coaches leave a job, regardless of if they were Power 4 or if they're G5, there's a lot less hesitancy to bring in those G5 players after seeing what Cignetti was able to do with all of his former G5 players from JMU and bringing them in and immediately turning around the Indiana Hoosiers. Cignetti has not only been bringing in these players, though, he's also been hitting on his evaluations at an astonishing rate. It's not just enough to bring in players from the portal. They're not automatically going to be stars just because they were in the portal. In fact, there's a high risk, high reward situation with those portal players, as you don't know the full reason why they are leaving the school they're coming from. So it's key that you need to be able to hit on your evaluations, and Coach Sig has been able to do that as he's taken a team full of 3 stars to the national championship. His team is also very experienced, with a lot of the players being 4th and 5th year and even 6th year players. And for those of you who are hoping that this Indiana run over the past 2 years is just a one-hit wonder, you'll probably be disappointed to hear that the Hoosiers have continued to add talent across the board through the portal, adding proven players like Nick Marsh, the wide receiver from Michigan State, and showing that their intention is to reload, not to rebuild after this year. And so then another trend we've seen in this new age of college football is that veteran rosters win championships. Regardless of who wins on Monday, the past 3 national championships will have been won by teams with a ton of game experience in their starting lineup. So Michigan and Ohio State both had teams where a lot of veteran players postponed their NFL careers to return to school and fight for one more shot at a national championship, and both teams were able to succeed in doing so. With Ohio State, there were a lot of players who were able to go to the draft who would have been picked, but they were unable to kind of live with not being able to win anything in their time at Ohio State, so they decided to return and try to win the game, which they weren't able to do, but they were able to win the national championship. And then Michigan had a lot of players do the same thing after their lack of playoff success and their attempt to go back and try to run it back to win a natty, which they're also able to succeed in doing. And so this formula was attempted to be recreated by multiple teams this year, including Penn State and Clemson, whose seasons both flew off the rails and ended with a heavyweight clash in the Pinstripe Bowl at the end of the year. So this formula isn't a set-in-stone thing where if you bring a ton of veteran players in, you're automatically going to win a national championship, which still makes it very impressive what Indiana and Miami have done this year. So instead of Penn State and Clemson, who were very popular preseason picks to win the national championship, it's Miami and Indiana who have continued this trend of having a veteran-led team make the national championship and win one. As they've climbed their way back to the Natty, or to the Natty in Indiana's case, by relying on that experience. And so we've seen this in the past few years too, because Ohio State, they needed to rely on that experience they had losing to Georgia in the Peach Bowl in 2022, and all of their losses to Michigan over the few years, and that experience and that knowing what they needed to do helped propel them to turn into that Death Star that they were in the playoffs. And then Michigan needed to rely on their experiences losing in the playoffs to Georgia and to TCU, and to really fuel that playoff run they had as well, and to know what it took to take that next step, as both teams had a lot of close calls where maybe the ball bounces a different way and they're able to go and win a national championship. But when they came back and they relied on their experience, they were able to reach the mountaintop. And so I think this trend is a direct result of the transfer portal thinning rosters out across college football. Teams are no longer able to stockpile 5-stars as their second and third strings. And so when a team is able to retain elite level talent, which would be able to go to the NFL, but they choose to come back, and they've played multiple seasons of college football, those teams are able to get a significant edge compared to their competitors. And being able to rely on those experienced players has been a key part of these championship runs for both teams. And we saw that with Carson Beck coming in with the 2-minute drill at the end of the game against Ole Miss, where he really didn't seem phased. He was executing at a really high level, and he was able to do that because he'd been in that situation before. So it's really key to have this experience. And then for Indiana, they were able to rely on their experience last year where they went into Ohio State and they got blown out, and then they went to South Bend to play Notre Dame in the playoffs, and they also got dominated. And so being able to rely on that experience has allowed them to really take that next step this year. And so this is really showing there's really no shortcut for the learning curve that teams face in college football. And we can see this with Ohio State this year, for example, where they had 5 projected first-round picks this year on their roster, in addition to Jeremiah Smith and the Heisman finalist quarterback Julian Sayin. But all this talent and this draft stock did not help them at the end of the season, where the team was really inexperienced and very young, where one of our leading starters and leading players turned 21 during the season. And so it was a very inexperienced team, and that ended up showing up in those key moments. And even though it was a supremely talented roster, they were lacking in experience in those huge, heavy situations. And so it really shows that when teams are able to bring in experienced players, or they're able to retain their rosters, they have an edge over those young, really talented but inexperienced teams because they've been there before and they know what it takes. And then the next one I don't want to spend too much time on because it's really been hammered home across pretty much every channel. But Indiana's meteoric rise to the peak of college football has really been incredible to watch. And it's remarkable how quickly Cignetti has rebuilt and transformed Indiana into the current national title favorite. He took one of the worst programs ever to win a Big Ten title and multiple blowout playoff wins, and that's just really incredible and unprecedented. And now he's the 8.5-point favorite for the national championship, and so that's something I think every Indiana fan would have laughed at you for if you suggested it at the end of the 2023 season, and really even at the beginning of the 2024 season, until they kind of started to build last year. And I remember watching Ohio State's opening game in the 2023 season against Indiana, where after the game, Ohio State got dropped 4 or 5 spots in the AP poll because they didn't beat Indiana by enough. Where now Indiana is the number 1 seed and they're undefeated heading into a national championship game where they are 8.5-point favorites. So it's really, really crazy to see the turnaround that program's had. And yeah, so really incredible stuff by the Hoosiers. And then our final storyline for the national championship is the homecomings that we're seeing in these games. Miami is going to play as the away team in a national championship, which is played in their home stadium and home city, obviously. And that's their program's first national championship game appearance since their overtime loss to Ohio State in the 2003 Fiesta Bowl. And so after a 23-year title game drought and 24-year championship drought, it must be extra special for Miami fans to have the opportunity to watch them reach the mountaintop potentially in their own backyard. And then on the other hand, we have Fernando Mendoza, who is a Miami native, who's going home to play against his hometown team for the national championship. And Mendoza wasn't recruited by Miami coming out of high school, and so I'm sure he'll be looking to prove them wrong and kind of I guess, get some sort of revenge against them in the championship. And I also want to take a moment to appreciate kind of how insane that is, and kind of ask the question if you could imagine being a lifelong Miami fan. Maybe you're 23 years old and you've never seen Miami reach a championship game in your life. Or maybe you're 45 and you've waited 24 years to see this happen again. And once you do, the team they have to play against is led by a person who maybe was your best friend, or he's your cousin, or maybe even a past student. And that's the situation a lot of people in Miami are finding themselves in now. And so that must be pretty tough to balance that relationship versus the fandom. And I'm happy I'm not in that position. But even though it would be nice to see another natty, but yeah, really incredible situation that Fernando Mendoza is in right now. And then another thing that is unrelated, but I thought was pretty awesome, was Mendoza promising Lil Uzi Vert national championship tickets if they made it. So hopefully that ends up happening. And then our final homecoming story of the matchup is about Mario Cristobal. So Cristobal left Oregon after the 2021 season to return to his alma mater as the head coach. He was a player for the Hurricanes from 1989 to 1992, where he won 2 national championships as a player. And now he has the opportunity to bring Miami back to glory in his 4th year as the head coach at Miami, which I think is really incredible and has to be incredibly personally satisfying for him if he were able to do so. And it's really something that pretty much everybody dreams of being able to do, and he has the opportunity to make it a reality on Monday. And then finally for today, I just want to take a quick look at what it means for the rest of college football if Miami wins the national championship. And overall, I think this would be the worst case scenario for contending teams across the country. So while Miami has had and utilized the resources to acquire elite talent over the last few years under Cristobal, many Florida recruits have left the state to play for elite programs all over the country because of one thing which the program was lacking, and that's national championship contention. So all of these players grew up rooting for the Hurricanes or the Gators or the Seminoles. However, once they were being recruited in high school, those programs had been out of the championship picture for years. These dormant premier programs in Florida have allowed elite talent to leave the state and elevate other competing teams. Ahead of the Cotton Bowl matchup with Ohio State, Jeremiah Smith even said that if Miami had been playing in games like the playoffs, he probably would have committed to Miami instead of the Buckeyes. After the big-time wins they've already had in the CFP, if Miami was able to add one more and win the national championship, they would be able to launch their recruiting to the stratosphere. It would all of a sudden become significantly more difficult for the SEC and Big Ten teams of the world to swoop in and convince players to leave their home state in hopes of winning a title. So if you're a fan of a contending team, it's probably in your best interest that Indiana wins the national championship instead of Miami. However, as we talked about before, Cignetti's not looking to rebuild. He's looking to reload, and it's possible giving him a title just creates a whole different monster in college football. So that's all we have for you today. So thank you for listening, and make sure to tune in for all your fantasy football and college football content. And I hope you have a great day.